The primary teacher for this class is Aaron White, but Aaron is in Ireland, finishing up a trip there. So this morning we have a guest speaker, and so let me introduce to you Dr. David Haines, who's the assistant professor of philosophy and theology at Bethlehem College and Seminary. So he's with us this morning, and as sort of an introduction to this class on the doctrines of grace, I believe he's going to be doing a biography of John Calvin for us. So let me pray, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Haines, and he will commence with this first meeting of a new class. Let's pray together. Father, thank you so much for bringing us to this day, a new year of ministry together. I do pray that you would watch over those in Ireland, our brothers and sisters there. We're so grateful for the partnerships you have given to us in Ireland. We're also grateful to be gathered here beginning this new class today. We're grateful for Dr. Haines being willing to come and to share with us this morning. I pray that the time would be edifying and encouraging, that it would stir our hearts even as we think about someone who has walked the road of faith before us and someone who we've benefited greatly from as you have used John Calvin to impact your church as few people have. So I pray that you would guide and direct and work through this class this morning. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen. Dr. Haines, it's all yours.
Thank you. One of the fun things about these types of microphones is that they don't work great with hairy people. And I come from the north and have the hair to prove it. So let's talk about John Calvin. John Calvin was born in 1509 and was not even 10 years old when the Reformation started. That is, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg. Calvin was about 10 years old. This such that, we often think about John Calvin as he's the reformer. In fact, he arrived late to the scene when the battles had already been won and the Reformation was well underway. He was not involved in originating the Reformation. Rather, he was a second-generation reformer. He is important, therefore, not as a first reformer, but for what he did, for what he wrote. His Institutes of the Christian Religion have become one of the most important works of theology to be written, if not since the Reformation, perhaps of all time. And so he's important less because he started the Reformation and more because of what he wrote. So what I'm going to do is, as I kind of go through this, I teach a lot of the courses that I teach at Bethlehem are historical courses. We look at historical theology, we look at history of the medieval time period and Renaissance Reformation, and I have found that when we're talking about history, seeing some things behind me, such as here, this is a recreation of John Calvin's house. So it's a 20th century recreation. They rebuilt the house based upon images that they found of what it would have looked like. And this is the house that he would have been born in Noyon, France. Another quick tidbit about myself. I mentioned I'm from the north. What I mean by the north is I'm from Canada, and I've been serving in Quebec for the past 20 years. 2 years ago, we moved here to Minnesota. And so I speak French, and so teaching John Calvin is always kind of funny for me because especially when I'm teaching to an English audience, I speak in English, but then I have to say everything he does, it's in French, right? And so Noyon, France, I throw on a French accent because I can't say it any other way. It sounds weird to say it in English. All right. So Calvin's family was very involved in the Roman Catholic Church in Noyon, France. His father was an ecclesiastical lawyer, and so Calvin grew up in the church, and he was destined to a life in the Roman Catholic Church. His early education, up till about the age of 14, would have been with the Famille Montmort, M-O-N-T-M-O-R-S, Montmort, where he began learning Latin grammar. Around the age of 14, he was sent to the University of Paris. So you can see here, this would have been the city of, kind of a wild map of the city of Paris in 1550. And I believe I have this is a portrayal of a faculty meeting at the University of Paris in the 1500s. We don't do faculty meetings that way anymore. It would be interesting if we all wore our gowns to faculty meetings, but that's not what it looks like anymore. So this is the type of life that he was inducted into when he went to the University of Paris. At the age of 14, I usually like pointing that out to my students who are typically starting closer to their 20s. They start. He began his studies as a liberal arts student at the Collège de la Marche, and he was able to master his use of Latin, refine his rhetoric. In fact, some of his professors described him as one of the most able authors in Latin of their classes. The University of Paris, where he was attending, was in fact one of the greatest universities of Europe. It was founded quite early on in the medieval period. One of the things that the medieval theologians and medieval societies gave us is universities. Universities were originated in cathedral schools, and the University of Paris has seen a number of very important theologians go through it. In fact, in the roughly 500 years preceding Calvin, some of the greatest theologians of the medieval period taught at the University of Paris, including, and if some of my students were here, they'd see me gritting my teeth as I say Peter Abelard, the famous nominalist, but also Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, who is the father of modern biology and geology. He was called Albert the Great because of his extensive knowledge of almost everything. And then, of course, everyone knows Thomas Aquinas. He was also at University of Paris. And that's just to name a few. You can go onto the University of Paris website, and if you might have to do a bit of hunting, but you can find a list of the many great names that have passed through University of Paris, and it didn't stop. Like after Calvin, many great thinkers have passed through that university. So the last of the ones that I mentioned, Thomas Aquinas, died almost 300 years before Calvin would put his feet onto the campus at University of Paris. And by the time that Calvin begins attending it, the University of Paris, as far as education had concerned, had fallen from its previous heights. In fact, by the time of the Reformation, much of the education being given in Europe and in Great Britain had become, how could I put this, somewhat pedantic, arguing about little tiny details in specific questions and not getting into the important aspects of theology and philosophy. Parker, one theologian who has written an autobiography of Calvin, a biography of Calvin, describes the University of Paris in the following way. By the time of Calvin, she was grown tired with age. Her theology lived in the past, not creatively, but with a hardened traditionalism that made it irrationally suspicious of any fresh approach to a problem, let alone new ideas. One of the fun things about the universities back then was that you know how academics tend to think of themselves as white collar, we're really fancy and cultivated. Well, not back then. Yeah, if back then, even into the Reform time period, like you think this is just medieval, but oh no, you go right into the Reform time period, and let's say you're having a theological debate at a university with another professor, and you're not successfully defeating him. You think your ideas are solid, and he should be succumbing to your intellectual prowess, and he just continues to reply, and he doesn't give in. Finally, you challenge him to a duel. We're not solving this in the debating. Let's take it outside. Choose your weapon. And that has happened. It happened to one of the great Reformed theologians of the time period, where Peter Martyr Vermigli, was in a debate with a Lutheran theologian, and the Lutheran theologian got fed up with this debate and challenged him to a duel. So this is the atmosphere in the academic circles, and sometimes, in fact, the academic circles could get violent. Not at the end of the medieval time period and the Reform time period. So, while studying at Collège de Montaigu, Calvin would have been introduced to the nominalist philosophy that was reigning at the time. So, by the time of John Calvin, Guillaume of Ockham had made gigantic waves in the academic world. Nominalism had become the reigning philosophy. If you want to know what that is, I can talk about that later. I'm not going to get into the details of that right now. And this nominalism had affected not just philosophy, but theology as well. One of the most important theologians by that time period was Gabriel Biel. And Calvin would also have been using, in the study of theology, the most popular textbook of theology at the time, which was Peter Lombard, his Sentences. Now, we often, if you read Calvin, you'll hear him mentioning Lombard, and you'll often hear Reformed theologians ridiculing Lombard. To be totally honest, a lot of the medieval theologians would have ridiculed Lombard as well. It's just it was the only and the best textbook they had on theology. And the reason why it was the best is because what Lombard had done is he had gone through every single church father from the 2nd century to, well, for about 1,000 years. And he had tried to find every single text that he could on every subject. And then he just took them totally out of context and then plopped them down. And it's like, okay, doctrine of God. Well, here's what Gregory Nazianzus says. Here's what Basil Caesarea says. And just puts them all down. And so it's this kind of like this collection of primary texts on all of these subjects, but totally taken out of context. And so that was the textbook they used. And it was horrible. But that's the best they had. And so typically, late medieval time period, moving into the Reformation, if you wanted to become a professor of theology, not only did you have to study Lombard, you actually had to comment on it, which meant you had to teach a class using Lombard. That was the gauntlet you had to pass through. And so Calvin would have learned from the Sententia of Peter Lombard. He also would have studied at this time some of the church fathers from the first 4 centuries of the church. He didn't go into as much depth as he would have liked to, however. And it's generally agreed that Calvin had almost no interaction with the realist area or a school of thought from the medieval time period, including Thomas Aquinas himself. Some have suggested, I don't know if I would go that far, but some have suggested he never actually read Thomas Aquinas himself. He certainly probably had a professor who exposed him to Thomas Aquinas. However, the professors who would have exposed him to Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and others of that type of theology, they would have been looking at it negatively. And so it wasn't as, hey, this is a great guy that we want, but rather, hey, this is our enemy, we don't like him. Because like I said, at the time period, Occam and nominalism Occam's nominalism was the reigning doctrine of the time, the enemy of which was Aquinas, Augustine, and others. So, what that means is that when Calvin refers in his writings, and this is kind of a tip for reading Calvin, when he refers in his writings to the scholastics, he is not referring to all scholastics. Scholastics, by the way, is just a term which means essentially academics. It means professor. And so when we talk about the scholastics, it's kind of like you're saying, let's talk about the academy and all of those professors in the academy, right? Well, when you say that, we recognize that not all professors in the academy agree. There are different schools of thought. In fact, within the academy, you're going to find Calvinists, you're going to find Arminians. And if you say just, let's talk about academics, well, both Arminians and Calvinists fall under academics. And it's the same thing with scholastics. Within scholasticism, you have people such as Guillaume of Occam or Jean Duns Scotus, and you have Aquinas and Albert, and they hold entirely opposing positions. In fact, Occam and Scotus built their philosophy in opposition to Aquinas. And so who is Calvin talking about when he talks about the scholastics? He's talking primarily about those who he knows, those whom he was taught. And that is primarily William of Occam, John Duns Scotus, and Gabriel Biel, and some of the scholastics of his own time period. So that's one thing. He is very negative about the scholastic thinkers in general. However, if you pay close attention when you're reading his works, you will find underlying much of his writings, there is a scholastic approach to reflection on things. And then thirdly, most of Calvin's early interaction with the early church fathers, Greek philosophers, and medieval theologians was because of or through his professors and how they had been taught. When he's 19, so he starts out at 14 at University of Paris. When he's 19, his father gets into a conflict with the leaders of the church in Noyon, and his father, in reaction to the conflict, removes Calvin from his studies. At the time, he was doing theological studies and says, nope, that's not happening. You're going into law. And so he sends Calvin to study law in order to become a lawyer. This is the end of his formal training in theology. And he is sent to study law at first Orléans, France. He's there for about a year, after which, and you can see here, this is an area where Joan of Arc would have led the siege of Orléans in 1428. That would have been 100 years before Calvin arrived in Orléans to study law. This here is Grolot, the Maison Grolot, built roughly around the 1500s. Something that Calvin might have seen as he was walking the streets of Orléans for a year. Afterwards, he went to Bourges. Here's another house that Calvin might have seen. Bourges. Here's a place in Bourges built roughly the 1500s, still exists today, built for a professor of law, perhaps someone that Calvin might have studied with. Here's another building in Bourges, which dates back to the 1500s. Of course, many of these things have been renovated since Calvin was there, but you can kind of see the basic idea of the buildings there. So he studies law in Orléans and then Bourges, and he was able to spend more time studying the classics and Greco-Roman literature. He also studied Greek at this time to learn the Greek language. And his studies in Greco-Roman literature and in the Greek language, he's doing this on his free time. Okay? His academic studies are law at this point. It's at this point in time when he discovers the freedom of humanist studies, and he discovers like the Renaissance for him. Just all of a sudden, it just blows up. It's like, wow, this is incredible. And so he starts reading the great humanist Renaissance thinkers such as Erasmus and Jacques Lefebvre, Rousselet, and Montaigne. And he starts reading these authors and falls in love with them. And so he's studying law at school, and in his free time, he is studying humanist Renaissance literature, looking at Greco-Roman literature, learning Greek, and so on and so forth. His love for letters and humanities is lit at this point. He also comes into contact with the writings of Martin Luther while he is here, and meets Theodore de Bèze, who we know today as Theodore Beza. He continued at Bourges for about 3 years until the death of his father, after which he felt free to pursue studies as he wished, and so he immediately dropped law and went back to Paris so he could continue studying theology and letters. At this point, however, he doesn't go back into formal studies. He essentially begins private studies and writing, and lives on stipends that he had been receiving from the Roman Catholic Church. And so he was receiving money from the Roman Catholic Church to be able to do his studies, and so he just kept receiving that money and lived on it for a while and fell into frequent financial difficulty. He was a great admirer. At this point, because of his Renaissance studies, he's a great admirer of the Stoic philosophers, and so he starts writing books. Probably the first book that Calvin writes is actually a commentary on the Greek philosopher Seneca, his book De Clementia. It's the first book he writes. And he wrote that, as far as we know, shortly after he converted to the Reformation movement. And this is that time period that this is all going on. Some people think, it has been said, that he so loved Stoic philosophy that he read Cicero every single day of his life. And I think that's a slight exaggeration. I have Cicero in my library, and you can't read the De Natura Dei of Cicero. You cannot read that in a day. It's not possible unless that's all you're reading and you have nothing else to do. Okay. However, the point is not so much did he read this often, it's that he did enjoy it, or he did enjoy it quite a bit. And in fact, Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, the approach that Cicero uses to how does man know God, that's actually going to become fundamental for Calvin's understanding of how does man know God as we find it in the Institutes of the Christian Religion. In fact, we often think of talking about the knowledge of God for Calvin, we think of how he talks about the sense of the divinity that man has, the sensus divinitatis. And we sometimes think, oh, that's unique to Calvin, that's new. No. Calvin got that from Cicero On the Nature of the Gods. And he uses that very beautifully to talk about how man knows God as creator. So, during this time period between 1530 and 1532, not only does he dive deep into humanist, Renaissance, and Stoic philosophy, not only does he write this commentary on Seneca, he also converts to the theology of the Reformation. We don't know exactly when. Calvin was not really open about his interior life. On occasion, we will find in some of his letters comments about what brought him to accept the Reformation. But it's very hard to find. And so we don't know exactly when it happened. We just know that it did happen sometime between 1528 and 1532. By the time we get to 1533, Calvin is forced to separate from the Catholic Church. Like Luther, this was not a willful, I'm out. I don't want to have anything to do with this corrupt church, so much as a being chased out. And when I say being chased out, I mean literally being chased out. So in 1530, let me see here. 1534, let me see if I need to catch up here. Okay, good, we're not there yet. All right, so in 1534, one of his good friends, Nicholas Kopp, writes a sermon that apparently Calvin helped him with. He preaches this sermon at University of Paris, and it caused an outrage in the faculty at the University of Paris, and it forced them to flee. Not only did they have to flee Paris, they also had to flee France. It was like they couldn't get them far enough away. And so, at this point in time, they are joining officially the Reformation. They're chased out of Paris. Calvin travels for about 2 years before finally arriving in Basel. So here is Basel, Switzerland, in just before the beginning of the 1500s. Okay, we're not at Geneva yet. Okay. And so he travels for about 2 years with the intention of settling down to the life of the academy. And at this time, he studies in greater depth the church fathers, such as Ambrose, Cyprian, Tertullian, Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, and Augustine. And Augustine becomes one of Calvin's favorite theologians of all time, if I could put it that way. Calvin will quote each of these authors in his Institutes. He quotes others as well, who he greatly loves and admires, but Augustine would certainly be his favorite. At this time, while he's in Basel, he begins learning Hebrew, and he starts working on another book. That book would be the Institutes of the Christian Religion. The early Institutes of the Christian Religion, written in Latin, was about 6 chapters long. Quite short. And I'm not going to give you an entire history of the manuscript development of the Institute of the Christian Religion to get to what we have today. I will point out a couple of interesting facts. So in August of 1535, Calvin completes the manuscript of the first edition. He written totally in Latin. It's published in March of 1536. Why so long, publishers? That's basically it. That's the reason. I can tell you today, I've got a couple of books out there, and I was approached recently to have a second edition of one of my books published, and that was back in March of this year, and the entire summer spent doing edits and the edits are being sent back and forth from the editor to the publisher and back to me, and maybe sometime this year it'll be published. So we'll see what happens. So editors, sometimes take time to publish. So Calvin would return to this book frequently, and he re-edited it and republished multiple manuscripts of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. He did his own French translation. I have a facsimile PDF of his own translation into French of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, based upon I think it was the late 1530s, early 1540s Latin edition. Finally, we get the ultimate edition in 1559. It is also in Latin, and that is the edition that most good English translations will be based upon, the Latin 1559 edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. That final edition basically what he does is he takes everything he's done before, he reworks it entirely, reorganizes it, and puts it into the basic structure of the Apostles' Creed. And so when you're reading through it, the order of topics is based upon the order of subjects in the Apostles' Creed. I would suggest that this is partially what started the Reformed tradition to write commentaries on the Apostles' Creed. And if you go and look through the history of Reformed theology, you're going to find many, many, many Reformed theologians with commentaries on the Apostles' Creed. Okay, so during his travels in 1536, he's on his way to Strasbourg. Strasbourg is a great university town. It's the place where all academics want to go. Well, one of the places. University of Paris is good too, but Strasbourg is this great university town. He's on his way to Strasbourg, but there's a war in taking place. And so he has to do a detour. His detour takes him through Geneva. He stays there for the night, and he basically gets kidnapped by his best friend. That's a funny way of saying his best friend convinces him, you've got to stay with me in Geneva and help this nascent Reformed church in Geneva. And so in 1536, he is convinced to stay there, moving to Geneva. There we go. And he begins working with Farel in Geneva. Okay, we will get to Strasbourg eventually, with this recently founded Reformed church. It hadn't been easy, but they succeeded just prior to Calvin's arrival in Geneva to get the city council to essentially kick the Roman Catholics out and make Geneva a Reformed city. Now, that sounds like, hey, everyone's Christian, we're all Reformed, right? No. By the time that Calvin gets to Geneva, there's a term in French called, we'll say something like, c'est un bordel, okay? Or un bordel is, how can I put this? It's essentially a place where prostitutes live. That's what Geneva was like at the time of Calvin. It was a really bad town. I'm not sure that I could find an easy comparison today. Not everyone was Christian, not even close to being Reformed. What they meant by we made it a Reformed town was Roman Catholics are no longer allowed to offer Mass in Geneva. But the Reformed Church can offer the sacraments and to preach. That's what that meant. And so Calvin arrives there, and it's kind of like, whoo, it's rock and roll here. The city itself, riotous and bloody, and roughly 13,000 people. It's not a big city. For comparison's sake, get out of Minneapolis and go to any small town, and that's probably the size of Geneva. Roughly 13,000 people. Calvin's goal in Geneva was not only to see the church in Geneva grow, but to create a city whose citizens were all faithful believers. That was the goal. Parker describes Calvin's goal this way. Calvin's aim in Geneva was to build up a church that should be national and confessional. Calvin and his colleagues worked tirelessly, their chief endeavor to persuade the councils, multiple councils, to accept an ecclesiastical constitution that would spring forth from and embody Reformed doctrine. Unfortunately, his dream of a Reformed city went south really quickly, and he and his colleagues, Farel and others, were expelled from the city and told never to return. After that defeat, Calvin returned to Basel with the hope, ultimately, that he would finally be able to adopt the life of a scholar. So this is one thing about Calvin. His entire life, all he ever wanted was to be left alone with books. Like that's what he wanted. And everywhere he went, people were like, Calvin, we're glad you're here. We need your help. And you can kind of see him. You can almost, I'd like to imagine Calvin walking into a city with his backpack full of books, like finally some rest, and then somebody who knows who he is, Calvin, we're glad you're here, and just, where can I put my books? What are we doing here, right? So he goes to Basel, he's like, yes, finally I can become a scholar, and this was not to happen. He was called to serve at Strasbourg, where he became friends with Martin Bucer. So here's a picture of the Place du Marché au Cochon du Lait, which is a really funny sentence in French. Le marché is kind of like the place where you go, like a farmer's market. It's essentially a market. Au cochon is the plural for pigs, and then du lait is milk, which I'm going to tell you the truth, I don't know what's going on there. I've never had pig milk before, and I'm not really tempted. But this would have been a place, like obviously without getting rid of the modern trappings, this would have been something like what Calvin would have been seeing as he's in Strasbourg. These are very, very similar style houses to what they had at that time. And so he arrives in Strasbourg, where he becomes friends with Martin Bucer, and he begins a very intense theological work. He teaches at the Haute École, which had been founded in 1538 by Jacques Sturm. It's also at this time that he writes his commentary on the Epistle of Paul to the Romans. And at this time, it's while he's at Strasbourg that he gets married. And you'd like to think, ooh, a nice titillating story of Calvin, the theologian who falls in love with a woman and gets married. Oh no. His friends decide, Calvin, you need a wife. And so they hunted him down a wife and found him a wife, and he got married to her. This was an arranged marriage by his friends. And so in August of 1540, Calvin married the widowed Idelette de Bure. She had 2 children already, Jacques and Judith. And towards the end of his time in Strasbourg, he was frequently asked to return to Geneva, resisting at first. Why in the world would he want to return to Geneva? Like, this is one of his big places where he failed. But he was constantly being asked, please come back to Geneva. And finally, he did return to Geneva to stay. Let me see here, after Strasbourg. There we go. Finally, he did return to Geneva to stay on September 13th, 1541. He brought with him his wife and one of his children. As far as we know, Jacques stayed in Strasbourg, but Judith came with them. And he also brought with him his younger brother, Antoine, and Antoine's wife, and 4 children. And they moved around a little bit when they first arrived in Geneva. They finally settled on in the house at 11 Rue de Chanoine in Geneva. It would have been a 2-story house. So if you can imagine, let me see, how can I go back here? Let me see if I can find I'm going to go back a little bit further. Oh, that one would work. So imagine a house like this, but 2 stories. Maybe, and so you'd enter into that first door, and the very first room in the house would be a living room. Behind the living room is the kitchen, and all of the bedrooms are up on the 2nd floor. If you walked out the back door into the backyard, you'd have a little garden going up to the wall, a big wall of the entire, going around the entire town. And then from his house, you could actually see the Alps. And so he had a beautiful view. All right, getting back over here. There we go. This is actually, by the way, would have been something like his Genevan Institute that he founded while he was in Geneva. And so he lived in that type of a house. He would not have been rich by the standards of his time, but he was also certainly not in need of financial help. It's always difficult to kind of figure out, hey, if he was paid X amount of money, what would that be like today? It's really hard to kind of figure that out, to be totally honest, because currency back then, it's kind of fluctuating in what it's worth. I can give you something along the following lines. We know that at first he was given his house free of rent, and he was given enough corn and meat. I better look at my notes. Corn and wine, sorry. He was given enough corn and wine for his household. So they had free housing. They had a certain amount of food that was given them. They had wine. And then on top of that, they were given 500 florins per year. Okay, and you're like, 500 florins. If that equates out to dollars, we're not doing very well, right? I'll tell you, it does not equate out to dollars. So, like I said, it is complicated to figure this out, but I'll give you a quick estimate. In the 1500s, 1 florin would be worth about 7 lira, or lire, okay? Or 24 pence. Still doesn't sound like a lot. But your average general laborer in the 1500s would receive about 1 to 2 lire, or 3 to 5 pence per day. That was their daily wages, 3 to 5 pence per day. 1 florin is worth 24 pence. And he received 500 florins per year. Eventually it was raised to 600 florins. All right, that sounds weird. By the way, I'm not a mathematician by any means, okay? But I'm trying to give you a quick idea here. Yearly wages for your general laborer would be roughly 1,000 pence. Well, it depends who was paying you, 400 to 1,000 pence. So essentially what Calvin would have been receiving would have been 2 to 3 times. I'll just give you the conclusion. He would have received 2 to 3, maybe 4 times as much as your general laborer per year. So he was doing okay. He was not in need of anything. 500 florins was significantly more than your average general wage laborer. Again, keep in mind, these are rough estimations based upon what we know, the 1500s, and the changing currency. His wife, with whom he never had any children, she did bear him a son, but he died prematurely. He was born prematurely and did not make it. So he never had any children with his wife. She dies in 1549. Shortly after, remember at the time, he and his wife with their daughter were living in this house in Geneva with his brother, Antoine, and his wife and 4 children. A year later, his brother's wife is convicted of adultery and exiled from Geneva. Okay? Of course, his brother divorces the wife, and he remarries and has 4 more children with the new wife. Now, why am I pointing this out? The bulk of Calvin's work done in Geneva is not done where he would like to have had it done. That is, in the academy, in the quiet, perhaps, of a garden, as he pores over manuscripts and then writes. No. The bulk of Calvin's research, writing, and pastoral ministry is done in a house with no less than 8 children running around. Screaming. I mean, for those of you who have children, you know what that's like. My students always find it odd that I enjoy heavy metal rock and roll. I have 4 children that were at home while I was doing my PhD work. The only way I was not jumping up and running out of my office at like every 5 minutes to find out, is someone dead, was for me to have music that overwhelmed all of the noise and screaming of children running around the house, banging pans and dropping toys and all kinds of things. So you can just imagine John Calvin without the luxury of putting headphones in his ears, doing his work with 8 children running around the house. His house was full of people. Calvin spent the remainder of his life in Geneva. He founded this institute, which became one of the more important institutes of the time in 1559. Through the foundation of this, Geneva became the intellectual hub of the French language Reformation. Calvin worked incessantly. I want to give you kind of a picture of what Calvin was doing. He worked without stopping. He worked all day, often well into the night. His friends would often plead with him, "You need a break, take a break." But Calvin was the type of guy that taking a break meant reading more. It's like, okay, I'll stop reading this. Give me another book, And so he never stopped studying. He did the work of a pastor, not as much as some of the other pastors. And so what I mean by that is he would visit people, but he was not visiting every single person in his church on a regular basis. He would go and visit the sick. He married people. Okay, like he celebrated marriages. He celebrated, let me see where I got this, roughly 270 marriages, and he performed 50 baptisms. Now, you might say that that's a lot. Well, it depends for how long of a period we're talking about, right? He did the work of a pastor, but his primary occupation as pastor was preaching the Word of God. And so I would suggest, if you want to know the thought of John Calvin, if you want to say, hey, what does John Calvin think on X subject? Go read his commentaries on the Word of God. His institutes are excellent, but that's not his greatest work. His greatest work are his sermons and his commentaries on the Word of God. That's where we need to be going to understand Calvin and his heart. He did apparently go on 1 or 2 holidays, not very often. And he was a man who was somewhat sickly. In fact, you remember back when I mentioned that his friends found him a wife? That when they asked for, what are you looking for in a wife? He said, well, I'm not too worried about her physical beauty. One of the things that I think is important is that she's able to take care of me. And I'm not even kidding. That was one of his standards. Is I need to have a woman who's willing and able to take care of me. He was a sickly individual. He got sick frequently. And eventually, he did succumb to his illnesses in 1564. And that would be when he died. His primary role at the church, however, was to preach the Word of God. He did this every single year. He often preached twice on Sundays, as well as many times during the week. So and sometimes during some weeks, every single day. With the exception of 1 year in the winter of 1558 to 1559, he was preaching without stop. As far as his character is concerned, Parker is helpful on this. He goes through all of Calvin's letters, and he goes through all of Calvin's friends and what they have to say about Calvin, and he kind of compiles this and gives us a picture of the type of individual Calvin would have been. And here's his description. Reserved, he certainly was, but not cold. Hasty and impatient, but not vindictive. Sensitive, easily wounded, and highly strung. From this comes his chief fault as a man. His temper, sharp by nature, was irritated by circumstance. So he did have a temper, and he actually talks about this himself. He could get quite angry. The fact remains, his friend Colladin says frankly that towards the end of his life he was peevish and difficult. Others have found him too choleric. Choleric meaning angry or upset. Now, I would like to make sure there's a nuance that we put in there. He was a sickly person. He was not very healthy most of his life. And when you are living with constant illness, that's just one extra thing that acts on you, on your temperament, right? And so if you're in pain and get aggravated, it's sometimes hard to control yourself. And so his friends did note that towards the end of his life, he had a harder time controlling his temper. But most of his life, he was able to. And and that would have been the type of individual that he was. All right. I don't want to take too much longer. Where am I on my slides here? That's Geneva. Okay, yes, I wanted to get to this. I know that looks huge. I'm sorry. These are the things I do for fun. So I want to talk a bit about his influence as I conclude with this section here. Then if there's any questions, I'll take them. So one of the difficulties with talking about Calvin's influence is it's kind of twofold. One, so many people have been influenced by Calvin since Calvin lived and wrote that it is honestly kind of hard to say who. It's everybody. In fact, arguably, even Jacobus Arminius was influenced by Calvin. In fact, at the time of Arminius, he was a Reformed doctor in a Reformed school. And you know all the quotation marks there, okay? Influence can mean that you interact with and reject just as much as influence can mean that you interact with and accept. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. That's one of the things that makes it complicated when you say, hey, who did he influence? But also what's complicated is that Calvin was not the first Reformed theologian. He was a second-generation reformer. Prior to Calvin, we already find the work of Ulrich Zwingli, Heinrich Bullinger, who are Reformed theologians. Almost the entire English church, in the Church of England, in its early period where they are fighting to bring the Reformation into England, they have almost no contact with Calvin. They're reading Martin Luther. And Martin Luther was influenced in them. And so Thomas Cranmer, for example, one of the first English theologians to bring the Reformation to England, almost no knowledge of Calvin, at least no influence of Calvin in his actual writings. And so that makes it kind of complicated. Other Reformed theologians who were contemporaries of Calvin, but may or may not have been influenced by Calvin, include some of the Italian Reformed theologians, who I really enjoy their story as well. Think about Girolamo Zanchi, or Peter Martyr Vermigli, who came to the Reformation while they were in the center of Roman Catholic thought, that is, in Italy. And they had to flee for their lives. Vermigli, his time period, was often considered the greatest Old Testament scholar of that time. And we have letters from Calvin to Vermigli asking for Vermigli's thoughts on Calvin's institutes. And Vermigli, the lifetime scholar, would write back and say, well, I wish you would say it this way, or I wish you would change it, and because the wording here could be a bit more precise. Calvin writes back, of course, and says, well, I agree with you, but I would lose the rhetorical punch. And he wants that rhetorical punch as well, right? And so you have these exchanges between people. So that's why I put this up here. Does this thing have a laser on it? Ooh, I think it does. Does it work? Okay, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. All right, well, so basically, if you look up here, Everything there, you can see all the ones that kind of in yellow: William Tyndale, Peter Martyr from Zwingli, Calvin, Zonke, Beza, Bullinger, Knox, Farrell, Bucer, like right down that list, okay? And then look at the R's. Everything up there that says R is a Reformed theologian. One of the things I think is just absolutely wonderful about this time period is you don't have one or two theologians. It's not Calvin and Luther out there, fighting for the Reformation. It's all of these people right down the list. And that's even a small group. That's a small list. I couldn't fit everybody on there. That's why it looks like that. So who did Calvin influence? It's a good question. Because many Reformed theologians afterwards were influenced by Bullinger, Beza, and so on. We can trace some people. We can talk about different Reformed Calvinist schools. And so if I could give I'll give a small list, and then I'll stop. We know for certain that, for example, the Dutch Reformed School of Kuyper, Dooyeweerd, Bavinck were heavily influenced by Calvin. Bavinck is one of the greatest Reformed theologians that you can go to from the last 200 years, like maybe 300 years. Like in the past multiple generations of Reformed theologians, multiple hundreds of years, Bavinck will be one of the best. We can look at what I would maybe call scholastic Calvinism. You can talk about people like Francis Turretin, who is probably one of my favorite Reformed theologians of all time, writing in the 1600s. The Institutes of Eclectic Theology by Francis Turretin, who was heavily influenced by John Calvin. Those institutes became the primary textbook for teaching Reformed theology in almost all institutes until it was eventually replaced by Charles Hodge's Systematic Theology, 3 volumes. You know why Charles Hodge's Systematic Theology eventually replaced Francis Turretin's Institutes of Eclectic Theology? Because the institutes for Turretin were still in Latin. And by the time that at Princeton, when they were teaching Reformed theology, the students were having trouble with Latin. And so they decided we'll move to Hodge because Hodge is written in English. Francis Turretin is now available in English, and you can get a hold of him. He was heavily influenced by Calvin. We would call him maybe a scholastic Calvinist. We could look at the School of Reformed Epistemology by Alvin Plantinga. Favorite story about Alvin Plantinga is he used to work at University of Notre Dame, and I remember hearing a lecture of him saying that one of the things on his bucket list was to become the first Protestant pope. We can talk about the presuppositionalist movement stemming from Cornelius Van Til at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And I leave to the end another of my favorites, the important Princeton Calvinists. Some of the greatest theologians to live in North America. Looking at B.B. Warfield, for example. Gerhardus Voss, Charles, and the Hodges. These names who I'm listing, these are all men, great theologians in their time and still helpful for today, who were heavily influenced by Reformed thought in general, but by Calvin in particular. And so we see the influence of Calvin over the centuries, spanning even to today. I'll stop there and take questions. I don't know how much time I have. Maybe I went over. I wasn't really not looking at the clock. My phone vibrated a number of times, and I imagine that was the pastor like, hey, you got to stop. So at this point, I'm willing to take questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. If I don't know, well, half of my knowledge is actually in my library, in my office, because my students will say, hey, I've got a question for us. Like, hold on, let me pull a book off the shelf. That's my way my brain works. Okay, you had a question? Probably the city. Yep. Calvin was very much of the mind that the city and state should be working together. They're not running the same thing. What the city does and what the church does, they have 2 different spheres of work, you might say. The church takes care of the spiritual life. The city takes care of the material life. However, those are overlapping boundaries because much of our material life is dedicated to our spiritual life. And so there's overlapping boundaries, and so that would be part of that. I saw a hand over there. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So here's my educated guess. If you ask Calvin, hey, are you a Calvinist? He'd probably say no. I mean, you might say, what do you mean? Like, well, of course, my name is Calvin, right? I'll say this, most of the theologians I've ever read throughout history from whom a school of thought has grown, if they knew that a school of thought had grown from their name and was associated with them, they'd probably be embarrassed. Augustine at one point, Augustine says, if you find anything in my works that is wrong, scratch it, like get rid of it. Just get rid of it right away. And I think Calvin would have the same idea. Calvin would have been humble enough to say, I don't know if I'm right on everything, and if I'm wrong, don't take it. Like, get rid of it. So the fact that there's a new school named after him, I think he would have found that weird. There has been debates about Calvin versus the Calvinists. How much of Calvin do the Calvinists actually adhere to, and what? One of my favorite things about today is, if you want like a funny reality about contemporary theology, many people who today call themselves neo-Calvinists are less orthodox or less Calvinist on certain doctrines than Jacobus Arminius. Like, think about that for a second. Like, that's just like, wait, what? So just because someone says they're Calvinist doesn't mean that they are actually following Calvin. My general, like, what I would say is, if you're saying I'm following Calvin and you haven't read the Institutes yet, stop calling yourself Calvinist. There's something about saying that you follow a school of thought that suggests that you know what that school of thought actually teaches. If you say I'm following Calvin or I'm following Augustine, you should know what they say on key topics, and not just like, hey, I know the 5 solas, right? So that's one thing I would maybe add into that. Typically, here's how I would approach the subject. For myself, I don't call myself a Calvinist. I call myself Reformed. And I believe Calvin would have said the same. Calvin would have said, we're Reformed. Yeah. Because the Reformed school brings in more than just Calvin. And Calvin was not the type of individual to say, yeah, that's me. What are the Reformed? Oh, they're people who follow me. He would have said, no, I'm a part of the Reformed churches. And so I would suggest, rather than calling yourself Calvinist, call yourself Reformed. Yeah. I could probably say more than I had to, yeah. How many, what was that word you said? Splinter groups, sure. Oh, that's a good question. By splinter groups, I take it you mean, you've got Calvin working and then you people working off of what Calvin is doing? Oh, okay. Other people that not necessarily associated with Calvin, but doing a Protestant Reformation as well? Oh, man. I don't know I can give you an accurate number. Maybe the best way to answer that would be find a map of the European and Mediterranean world at the time period. Try and localize every single country that's currently in the process of forming, and then multiply that by about 3, and that's how many Protestant reformers you've got going at that time period. In almost every single country, you've got at least 3 or 4 different theologians. And I think this is one of the beautiful things, by the way, about the Reformation. We're not talking about a movement of people. What we're talking about is a movement of formally trained theologians throughout the European and Mediterranean world who are looking at what the church has been saying thus far and saying, yeah, no, that does not accord with what we find in scriptures or within the fathers or church history at all. And so, there's a lot of people. I wouldn't say they broke away from the Reformation. These are all Protestant groups. And I think what was going on during the Reformation, one of the things we see happening is less of a breaking away and more of an attempt to accord. And it's not always working, right? The Lutherans and the Reformers, the Reformed often had fun little fights together. I mentioned Peter Marvimigli and his Lutheran colleague who challenged him to a duel over a debate, right? They didn't always get together, but they tried. Like that, and we have multiple confessions written during this time period by different Protestant movements and Reformed churches in various countries, all trying to say, this is what unites us. We may differ on things, but we are united by these things. And that's the purpose of these confessions, is to say, we stand on these truths. Yeah. And so I would say that if we're talking about a splintering movement, it wasn't the movement was towards we want to unite, not we want to splinter. Yeah. And of course, it doesn't always work. When you've got scholars working all over the place in all kinds of different countries, they're bound to have differences. And the goal was to bring them together. Yeah. Is that helpful? Okay. I saw another hand come up over this direction. I'm just okay. How long would it take to read these? So I cannot answer that question. And I'll tell you why. Part of it has to do with reading speeds. Part of it has to do with the difficulty of the subject. My students complain almost every semester about too many readings or readings that are too long. And I do run into the issue that I read theology and philosophy faster than your average Joe, just because I've been doing it for so long that I've gotten used to the language, and so I know what to expect. And so, and people, you guys, if you're readers, you recognize this, right? If you've read enough, you realize there are certain types of books that you can just read really fast and some that you can't. And it differs for different people. Your average person can read about 100 pages in about 2 to 3 hours, roughly, of deep theological thought. Now, what complicates that with Calvin is that the best edition of Calvin is 2 volumes, and each volume is about this thick. I had the first volume at home with me. I actually brought it this morning. Volume 1 and Volume 2 are both about this thick. We're talking close to, I want to say, 4,000 pages, and it's not, and big pages. So if you read maybe 10 pages a day, you could probably do it in a year, maybe. I think it's doable in a year, personally. I would say easily a year. But then you have to read a certain amount of pages at a certain speed. Yeah. And I don't know if you want to do that, because sometimes you want to dig deep. So that's about the best as I can give you, time. And again, I'm not a mathematician, so yeah.